Speaking of Alternatives with Eric Adler, President and CEO of PGIM Private Alternatives. As the world's population grows sharply and the demand for natural resources grows with it, institutional investors are increasingly recognizing the value inherent in agriculture. Eric explores the transforming landscape of agricultural debt and equity with Jamie Shen, Managing Director and Head of Agriculture at PGIM Real Estate.
It's hard for anyone not to have a visceral human attachment to agriculture. It's the food we find on our table. But it's also a growing asset class for institutional investors and insurers with long-term income and inflation-protecting characteristics. Before we get into the heart of this asset class, let's find a bit more about you, Jamie. Talk to me about how you came to agriculture, the space in general, but asset management more generally. What interested you about it?
Great. Thank you. Well, I grew up on a peach and walnut farm, and agriculture and farmland was very much part of our family identity. We had a roadside stand, and we were known locally for our peaches as the best in the area. Maybe some would argue with that, but I'm going to stick to it. During college, I went back to the farm every summer and worked to help the family and also pay for college. After graduating from Berkeley, I went into commercial real estate, working in downtown San Francisco. At 28, I went through a bit of an early midlife crisis and realized that where I felt the most me and grounded was on the farm. So I bought my own farm that was adjacent to the family farm. After a 25-year career in commercial real estate and real assets and working with institutional investors, which also included helping develop farmland portfolios, I decided I wanted to focus more on farmland, which sparked my decision to join PGIM about 7 years ago. Farmland and agriculture is my passion. And so it was nice to be able to combine what I had been doing in working with institutional investors and bringing forward the passion I have for farmland and investing in it.
Well, that's brilliant that you've been able to combine a passion with a career so effectively. So if you had 1 minute to convince me there's an opportunity here, what would you say?
Well, it's really quite simple. We have a growing world population and a shrinking supply of arable land. Land that can sustainably grow food will become more and more valuable over the long run.
All right. I'm far along the way to being convinced. We also like to unpack a headline each week. And one to explore that's appropriate for this topic is why institutional investors are plowing cash into farmland. Its reputation as a safe haven could be challenged by a changing climate. It's a great headline. It talks about the obvious interest for it, but already presages the fact that there are challenges. So how do you react to that headline?
Well, I agree that farmland is attractive to investors, a niche strategy. It's moving away from the niche strategy and becoming more mainstream. I also agree with the article about diversification and how that can help mitigate climate risk. However, there are areas that should just perform better as climate continues to change. That's one of the reasons why we focus on the U.S. Because in the U.S., you have some mitigations to climate change, and one, crop insurance really helps mitigate that. When you look at the climate maps, the U.S. has been identified as a potential winner and will be able to more sustainably grow agricultural products into the future. The U.S. has really been focusing on how to sustainably grow agriculture and products in the face of climate change, where we've been trying to protect a lot of our natural resources like water. And that's something that other areas across the globe may not be as focused on. There's been a lot of talk about in California, for example, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, a way where the U.S. can protect that valuable water resource so that we can think about it in a very measured and sustainable way.
Concerns about the environment and sustainability, as well as our health, tend to support the attractiveness of investing in sustainable agriculture and tapping into trends that promote healthy eating and healthy living.
That's incredibly varied, the things that someone in this space has to take into account over time. And the idea that places that might be at one level of effectiveness for agriculture can totally modify in the future, including improvements like what you're flagging in the U.S. So digging into the detail, Jamie, where are the real areas of focus for you and your team? Where are the challenges in the space? How do you think about working through these?
I think there are a lot of opportunities in agriculture and in farmland, and a lot of tailwinds to the sector. For example, the movement towards healthier foods. There's a lot of evidence that people want to have a healthier lifestyle and a better quality of life. The medical research, we're seeing a lot of that is tied to diet. I, for example, just found out that my cholesterol was going up a little bit. And so I immediately searched how to lower your cholesterol. And I found an interesting study from Harvard Health Publishing. And the foods that lower cholesterol were nuts, apples, grapes, strawberries, and citrus fruits. It was almost a laundry list of things that we are growing in our portfolio. So that is an opportunity that is important in our investment strategy to continue to focus on foods that can provide people with a healthier way of life. As more people gravitate towards those are going to become even more valuable. There's also technological improvements and advancements in life sciences and also in robotics and AI, sensor technology. All of this can help with one of the biggest challenges in farmland and agriculture, which is labor. So those are a couple of things that we're really focused on and wanting to make sure that we're taking advantage of in our portfolio. The other area that we're looking at is renewable energy. That is going to be another demand driver for agricultural products or for the land that the products are grown on. For example, biofuels, solar, and wind, all of those need either places to grow the biofuels or with solar and wind, a place to put the panels or the wind machines. Agriculture and farmland are uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. As far as headwinds or challenges, commodities are cyclical by nature, and this supply and demand can be in balance, out of balance in one way or the other. Right now, in some commodities, we have oversupply, and some of that continues to be hangover from logistical challenges that we had after COVID or during COVID, and also some trade barriers or trade wars. You also might have consumer preferences changing that can send your commodity supply demand out of balance. Right now, we also have a headwind of the higher interest rates. That is a challenge for some of our borrowers and other farmers using operating lines of credit. Another headwind is regulations. We want to have traceability into our food. We want to know, where does this come from, how it was grown. Labor continues to be a challenge. The access to labor and then the cost of labor, those are some of the headwinds that we are dealing with in agriculture.
Global supply and demand, as well as macroeconomic factors and government regulations, present a variety of challenges for agriculture, so it is paramount to have deep knowledge of the industry's fundamentals.
A lot of investors think about agriculture for the long term as an inflation hedge, as a really good source of income, and that's clear, but you're flagging that in the near term, there's all kinds of things that can get in the way of that, and navigating that in the shorter term is really the key to being successful in the long term. So Jamie, as you know, and you work with our distribution and business development teams across our business, we like to ask them what they're hearing, to put their ears to the ground with clients and gather questions from the floor. So let's go through a few of them. First, today, there's a divergence between row crop and permanent crop performance. Does it still make sense to have permanent crops? And maybe as a lead-in, you can give a brief overview of the difference between row and permanent crops.
So row crops are grown on an annual basis. So that could be corn, soybeans, rice, wheat. Permanent crops are, by the nature of it, something that is in the ground for a longer period of time. And that is typically trees, shrubs, vines. And so that would be nuts, apples, or citrus, and wine grapes or table grapes. Where we have seen the run up in values, there is a NCREIF farmland index. The farmland index tracks row crops and permanent crops returns separately. So we can see how the two different buckets have performed over time. in the 12-month period ending in March, row crops outperformed permanent plantings by over 13%. So we've seen this huge divergence that we don't typically see happening. And there's been a lot of reasons for that. Part of it has been that row crops are an easier way to invest for passive investors. There is easier access, and you don't have to have a lot of farming knowledge or capabilities because you can rent those properties out to farmers very easily. On permanent plantings, it's different. Typically, you are operating those assets and there's more farming knowledge required. So as we had inflationary fears, it was easier for passive investors and other investors to invest in row crops. Also, you had those commodities performing better and adding more profitability to local farmers. So we saw quite a run up there. Conversely, in the permanent plantings, we had some imbalances. We had trade wars going into COVID where there was tariffs being placed on our nut crops. During COVID, we had supply challenges in just getting the containers to be able to send out the shipments of the nuts. In these commodities, we really had an increase in the overall supply. Now we're trying to work through that. So we believe that with the demand drivers towards healthier diets, with the ability to more freely move products, that these challenges that the permanent crops have faced recently are going to dissipate and that they will perform over the long run.
That's great. So, second question, how is the impact of renewable energy showing up in farmland?
We are seeing it across our portfolio in a number of ways. One is we're seeing more options coming, looking for property to put solar on. So we're seeing it benefit this ancillary income coming from option payments, but also when those are converted into actual leases on properties or even property sales to solar, we are seeing an increase above what we could be achieving from just farming the land or receiving farm rental or what we would be selling the land for farming traditional crops. So we think of it as farming the sun and creating energy through that. And that is improving the returns to farmland.
That's really interesting to think that that kind of renewable energy is not only necessary, but it's actually an enhancer of return. I hadn't thought about that. So, Jamie, the third question is, how should investors think about risk and an agriculture allocation in their overall investment portfolios?
Eric, all investments have inherent risk. We are in the business of providing risk-adjusted returns, right? And so when we think about the risk of farmland and investing in farmland, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to other risks that the market can move against you. I think over the long run, though, where you're looking at farmland compared to other asset classes, there is a large degree of preservation of capital. And we have seen over time where farmland has tended to provide positive return. And I'm again focusing on the NCREIF index over every calendar year historically, or at least since the index has been available since 1990. So in some ways, there is the volatility, just like any other asset class in your income. We've talked about how the supply and demand of commodities can impact that volatility of your return and that of your income return. But it has been a nice diversification into portfolios compared to the other asset classes. But really, it has provided a nice preservation of capital over the long term. And we believe that it has a nice risk-adjusted investment characteristic that is beneficial.
Among the critical factors at play in agricultural investing is the increased use of mechanization, which can reduce the cost of labor. Diversifying this exposure to labor reliance versus mechanical harvesting is a key consideration both for today and as technology rapidly evolves.
How should investors think about labor? You talked about labor and mechanization. So what's the right balance between the two? And how are you navigating that in today's environment and thinking about it for the future as technology continues to advance?
Labor is a big challenge in farmland. When we're designing portfolios, we look at how do we diversify your portfolio in a lot of different ways. Of course, we look at it by commodity type. Like we want to have a very diversified portfolio by commodity. And then When you're diversifying by commodity, a lot of times you're also diversifying by geographic region. And then we want to go down a couple layers here. How much of your portfolio the products are being exported versus what is the domestic demand for those? We look at how much labor are you reliant on versus how much of the portfolio can be harvested and grown in a more mechanized fashion. So it's something that we consider when we're looking at overall portfolio diversification and portfolio risk and risk management. We do have certain crops that do require a bit more labor, but we're trying to look at ones that we believe will have some ability to take advantage of increased mechanization in the future. For example, apples today, you require a lot of labor to harvest those, but there's a lot of capital going into research on how we can move that into more of a robotics and how can we get that to a point when we can bring more mechanization into it. So when we're investing in properties and assets that even require a lot of labor today, we're making sure the ones that we're investing in are designed today for the future of mechanization. We're also largely limiting the amount of crops that we have in our portfolio that are very reliant on labor.
Something that's always fascinating for me is how much basic technology already goes into figuring out automatically what the soil needs, when it needs to be watered. There's all kinds of technology in these tractors and all that. And I think people underestimate how advanced farming is, just the nuts and bolts of it. It's not just a tractor with an engine anymore, right?
I think that it's oftentimes underestimated how much technology and mechanization already exists in farmland. For example, nowadays, almost all of the wine grapes are mechanically pruned, mechanically harvested, and people are really differentiating them, their brand or their label, if things are hand harvested. All of the nut crops are mechanically harvested. And there is a lot of sensor technology available in our machines, in how we're doing, and more to come. We do already have some autonomous tractors that are working in the orchards. We have already seen a lot of advancements over the past decade, and there's more to come, which is really exciting.
Jamie, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for participating in this podcast today. I found this such an important topic for all of us, for societal reasons, for geopolitical reasons. But the fact that it can be such a great investment opportunity must be very fulfilling for you, I believe, in terms of being able to ally the two, but also doing something and being a part of operating an area of the world that is so important for the future of all of us. Thank you so much. It's been great having you here.
Thank you.
Let me now give you my 3 biggest takeaways from everything that Jamie's communicated to us today on our podcast. And the first is that it is hard to find a better long-term macro trend investment opportunity than agriculture, with demographics leading to increasing need for food for a finite amount of farmable land. And the second big takeaway for me is that the ability to unlock this opportunity in an increasingly uncertain world dealing with climate change, inflation spikes to the cost base we've seen post-COVID, and all types of other geopolitical or regulatory uncertainty requires patience in the shorter term and a significant operational expertise. The existential importance of agriculture as an investment class is a primary consideration for all of us when we think of a growing population, the challenges of climate change, and perhaps some of the most profoundly impactful applications of our current and future technological breakthroughs. Well, that's it for this edition. Join us next time when our guest is Sultana Regal, head of U.S. Equity and Senior Portfolio Manager for U.S. Value Add Strategies at PGIM Real Estate. She will be here to talk all things affordable housing on Speaking of Alternatives.
Speaking of Alternatives with Eric Adler, a podcast from PGIM. Follow, subscribe, and if you like what you hear, go ahead and give us a review. And be sure to look for the podcast, The Outthinking Investor, also from PGIM. This podcast is intended solely for professional investor use. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. All investments involve risk, including the loss of capital. PGIM is not acting as your fiduciary. The contents are for informational purposes only, are based on information available when created, and are subject to change. It is not intended as investment, legal, or tax advice and does not consider our recipients' financial objectives. This podcast includes the views and opinions of the authors and may not reflect PGIM's views. PGIM and its related entities may make investment decisions that are inconsistent with the views expressed herein. This podcast should not be reproduced without PGIM's prior written consent. No liability is accepted for any direct, indirect, or consequential loss that may arise from any use of the information contained in or derived from this podcast. This material is not for distribution to any recipient located in any jurisdiction where such distribution is unlawful. PGIM is the global asset management business of Prudential Financial Incorporated, which is not affiliated in any manner with Prudential plc, incorporated in the United Kingdom, or with Prudential Assurance Company, a subsidiary of M&G plc, incorporated in the United Kingdom. Copyright 2024. The PGIM logo and the rock symbols are service marks of PGIM's parent and its related entities, registered in many jurisdictions worldwide.